Sometimes the choices that define us come when we least expect them. Sometimes doing the right thing costs us everything we have. In the Arizona Territory, a man named Jacob Mallory, folks call him Big Jake, rides out one morning to hunt elk for the winter. He's a simple rancher, standing 6'7", known for his steady aim and decent heart. But when he finds a young Apache woman left bleeding in the dirt after a bandit raid, his simple hunting trip becomes something much bigger. Bringing her back to his homestead means risking his life, his land, and everything he's built. What would you do when saving one life could cost you your own? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Broken Spur Ranch sat in a natural bowl of Red Rock Canyon country, where the Arizona Territory stretched out wild and unforgiving under an endless sky. Jacob Mallory had built his life here over the past 12 years, carving out a place where a man could breathe free and answer to no one but himself and the land. The ranch house was modest, rough-hewn timber and adobe, with a wide porch that caught the morning sun and offered shade in the brutal afternoon heat. Behind it stood a barn that had seen better days, a smokehouse, and a bunkhouse where his small crew of ranch hands made their home. Jake stood on that porch most mornings with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the sun paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. At 6'7", he cut an imposing figure even in stillness. His shoulders were broad from years of hard labor, his hands scarred and calloused, his face weathered by wind and sun into deep lines that made him look older than his 43 years. His hair, once dark as coal, now showed silver at the temples. But his eyes, pale blue and clear, still held the sharpness of a man who'd spent half his life reading the land and the other half reading people. The pocket watch in his vest was his most treasured possession. It had belonged to his father and his father before him, passed down through 3 generations of Mallory men who'd all died with their boots on. Jake pulled it out now, checking the time more from habit than need. The gold case was scratched and dented, the inscription inside worn nearly smooth. To James, with love eternal, M, his grandmother's hand, from a time when love was spelled out in careful cursive and meant to last beyond death itself. He tucked it back and turned at the sound of boots on wood. Tobias emerged from the house, wiping his hands on his apron. The old man had been with Jake since the beginning, cooking and keeping house and offering the kind of steady companionship that didn't require many words. He'd been a soldier once, fought in the war between the states, and come west like so many others, looking to leave the past behind. His dark skin had weathered to the color of old leather, and his hair had gone white as fresh snow. But his eyes were still sharp and his hands steady. "Coffee's fresh if you want some that ain't turned to mud," Tobias said, nodding at Jake's cup. "This suits me fine. Suit yourself. Miguel's got the horses ready if you're still set on heading up to the high country." Jake nodded. Miguel was young, barely 20, but he knew horses and worked hard without complaint. The boy had drifted in last spring looking for work, and Jake had taken him on. He was good company, even if he talked too much sometimes. Then there was Hank, older, surly, kept to himself. A capable hand with cattle, but not much for socializing. The 4 of them made it work, running a small operation that kept them fed and clothed with a little left over. "I'll be gone 3, maybe 4 days," Jake said. "Need to bring back enough elk to get us through winter." "Winter's coming early this year," Tobias observed. "I can feel it in my bones." "You be careful up there," Jake smiled slightly. "I'm always careful. You're always something." "But careful ain't the word I'd use." They stood in companionable silence for a moment. 2 men who'd shared enough campfires and hard times to understand each other without explanation. Finally, Tobias went back inside, and Jake made his way to the barn, where Miguel had his roan gelding saddled and ready. "Everything you need is packed." "Mr. Jake," Miguel said, his accent still thick despite 2 years in the territory. "Food for 4 days, ammunition, bedroll, medical kit. You're a good man, Miguel. Keep an eye on things while I'm gone, and keep Hank from drinking all my whiskey." Miguel grinned. I make no promises about the whiskey. Jake swung into the saddle with the ease of long practice. The roan, a horse he'd named Soldier for reasons he didn't share, shifted beneath him, ready to move. Jake had bought him from a cavalry remount station 5 years back, and the animal had proven worth every penny. Smart, sure-footed and calm under pressure. As he rode out, Jake let his mind wander to the past, as it often did on long rides. He'd been married once, to a woman named Sarah who'd had red hair and a laugh that could light up the darkest day. They'd met in Kansas, married quick, and come west together full of dreams about building something that would last. For 7 years they'd made it work. 7 years of shared labor and shared joy, of quiet evenings and soft words, of a love that felt like it could weather anything. Then the fever came. It swept through Copper Ridge one summer, taking the old and the young and the unlucky. Sarah fought it for 10 days, while Jake sat beside her bed and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. On the 11th day, she'd opened her eyes, squeezed his hand, and whispered, "Don't you dare stop living, Jacob Mallory." Then she'd closed her eyes and slipped away, and Jake had felt something inside him close up tight and lock itself away. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of going through the motions, of working from dawn to dusk to avoid the emptiness of the house at night, of lying alone in a bed that felt too big and too cold. He'd thought about leaving, about selling the ranch and drifting somewhere new. But he couldn't. This place held too many memories, and abandoning them felt like abandoning her. The ride to Copper Ridge took an hour. The town wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a sheriff's office, and a handful of other buildings that served the ranchers and miners who worked the surrounding territory. Jake stopped at the store to pick up a few last supplies, nodding to the handful of folks he knew. The storekeeper, a thin man named Patterson, eyed him with the usual mixture of respect and caution that most people showed Jake. Big men made folks nervous. Especially big men who didn't talk much. "Heading out hunting, Jake?" Patterson asked, tallying up the supplies. "Up to the Mogollon Rim. Should be elk up there this time of year. Be careful. Been reports of trouble up that way. Bandits, some say. Apache, say others." Jake's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Apache. The relationship between the white settlers and the native people had always been complicated, and it had gotten worse in recent years. The government kept pushing the Apache onto smaller reservations, and young warriors kept breaking out to raid and hunt. It was a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end, and Jake had seen enough of it during his time as an army scout to make him sick. He didn't talk about those years much. Didn't talk about the things he'd seen or the things he'd done. A man carried his past with him, whether he wanted to or not. And some loads were too heavy to set down. "I'll keep my eyes open," Jake said, paying for his goods. Before leaving town, he stopped at the sheriff's office. Bill Crenshaw sat behind his desk, boots up, reading a week-old newspaper. He looked up when Jake entered, and a slow smile crossed his weathered face. "Big Jake, heard you're heading into the high country. Word travels fast. It's a small town. You know how it is." Crenshaw swung his boots down and leaned forward. "You really ought to take someone with you. There's been trouble up that way. I work better alone. That's what Sarah used to say about you. That man's got one speed, alone and ornery." Crenshaw's smile faded. "I miss her, Jake. She was good people." Yeah, she was. They sat in silence for a moment, two men united by the memory of a woman who'd been kind to everyone she met. Finally, Crenshaw stood and walked Jake to the door. "You be safe up there. And if you run into trouble, you know where to find me." Jake nodded, shook the sheriff's hand, and rode out of town. The land rose steadily as he headed north, the desert giving way to juniper and pinon pine, then to ponderosa forests that smelled of vanilla and resin. The air grew cooler, cleaner. By nightfall, he'd made camp in a small meadow with good grass for Soldier and a clear view of the stars overhead. He lay in his bedroll, hands behind his head, and thought about nothing in particular. Tomorrow, he'd reach the high country where the elk gathered. Tomorrow, he'd do what he'd come to do. It should have been simple. It should have been just another hunting trip, Another few days alone with his thoughts and the land, but something felt different. Something in the air, or in the way the wind moved through the trees, or in the restless way Soldier kept lifting his head to stare into the darkness. Jake had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that something was coming. He just didn't know what. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Mogollon rim, painting the world in shades of pink and gold. Jake woke with frost on his bedroll and his breath misting in the thin mountain air. He built a small fire, made coffee, and ate a breakfast of hardtack and jerky, while Soldier grazed nearby. The forest was quiet, except for the morning birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridges, Jake was moving through the timber with his rifle in hand. He'd spotted elk sign the evening before. Fresh tracks, droppings, bark rubbed raw where a bull had marked his territory. This was good country for hunting, high enough to be cool even in summer, with plenty of water and meadows where the herds came to graze. He moved slowly, carefully, reading the land the way his father had taught him and the army had refined. Every broken twig, every scuff mark in the dirt, every bent blade of grass told a story if you knew how to listen. The elk were close. He could feel it in the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then he heard the gunfire. It came from the north, maybe 2 miles distant, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls, then another and another. Not the deliberate spacing of a hunter taking aim, but the rapid fire of multiple weapons. A fight. Jake's first instinct was to stay out of it. Whatever was happening up there wasn't his business, and a smart man didn't go looking for trouble in country like this. But then he heard the screaming, high-pitched, desperate, cut short by another volley of shots. Then silence, the kind that felt heavy and wrong. Jake stood frozen for a long moment, his mind racing. Could be Apache raiders, could be bandits, could be soldiers chasing down renegades. None of it concerned him. None of it was his problem. He started walking north. The closer he got, the more cautious he became. He tied Soldier to a tree in a sheltered spot and moved forward on foot, rifle ready, using every bit of cover the forest offered. The smell reached him first, gunpowder and blood, sharp and metallic on the clean mountain air. Then he saw the bodies. 2 Apache men lay sprawled in a small clearing, their bodies torn by bullets. They'd been dead maybe an hour, no more. Fresh blood pooled dark in the pine needles. One was young, barely more than a boy, his face frozen in surprise. The other was older, gray in his hair, and he died fighting. A knife still clutched in his hand. Jake knelt beside them, his jaw tight. He'd seen death before, plenty of it, but it never got easier. These men had been ambushed, shot down without mercy. Around the clearing, he found signs of what had happened. Boot prints from at least 5 or 6 men. Shell casings scattered in the dirt, gouges in the earth where horses had wheeled and turned. Then he saw the blood trail. It led away from the clearing, heading west toward a tumble of rocks and scrub brush. Not the blood of the 2 dead men, but a separate trail, someone wounded, crawling or being dragged. Jake followed it, his heart beating faster now. The trail was fresh, still wet, and it led him up a rocky slope to a narrow crevice between 2 boulders. That's where he found her. She was wedged into the rocks, trying to make herself small, invisible. An Apache woman, young, maybe 25, with long black hair matted with blood and dirt. She'd been shot in the left shoulder, high up near the collarbone, and the blood had soaked through her buckskin dress. Her face was pale beneath her brown skin, her breathing shallow and rapid. When she saw Jake, her eyes went wide with terror, and she tried to push herself deeper into the rocks. Jake raised his hands slowly, rifle pointed at the ground. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't understand English, or if she did, she was too frightened to show it. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice weak but defiant. Jake caught a few words. He'd picked up some of the language during his scouting days. Enough to understand she was telling him to stay back, to leave her alone. "Those men down there," Jake said quietly, keeping his voice calm. "Your family?" She said something else in Apache, then coughed, and blood flecked her lips. The bullet wound was bad. Without help, she'd be dead by nightfall, maybe sooner. Jake knew he should walk away. should leave her here and pretend he'd never seen her. Getting involved would bring nothing but trouble. Trouble with the law, trouble with the town, trouble with every white settler who already lived in fear of Apache raids. But then he saw what she clutched in her good hand, a small leather pouch stained with blood, a medicine bag. He'd seen them before. Apache people carried them as protection, filled with sacred items and herbs. This one had intricate beadwork on the front, clearly made with great care. She was holding on to it like a lifeline, like it was the only thing keeping her in this world. Jake made his decision. He set his rifle down and pulled off his shirt, tearing it into strips. The woman watched him with eyes that flickered between fear and confusion. When he moved toward her, she tried to fight, one weak hand pushing at his chest, but she had no strength left. Jake gently but firmly moved her hand aside and pressed the cloth against her wound. She cried out in pain, and the sound cut through him like a knife. "I know," he said softly. "I know it hurts. But if I don't stop this bleeding, you're going to die." He worked quickly, efficiently, binding the wound as best he could with the makeshift bandages. The bullet was still in there. He could feel it when he probed gently, but pulling it out here without proper tools would do more harm than good. He needed to get her back to the ranch, to Tobias and the medical supplies they kept for emergencies. As he worked, his mind raced through the implications. The men who'd done this, bandits most likely, wouldn't have just left if they thought someone had survived. They'd be back, or they'd be hunting for her. And if Jake was found with an Apache woman, wounded or not, there'd be questions he couldn't answer. At best, he'd be branded an Indian lover. At worst, they'd accuse him of collaborating with the enemy. The woman had passed out by the time he finished bandaging her. Jake carefully lifted her from the rocks, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. He carried her back through the forest, to where Soldier waited, the horse's ears pricking forward nervously at the smell of blood. Getting her onto the horse took some doing. Jake finally managed to sit her in front of the saddle and climb up behind her, holding her against his chest to keep her from falling. She stirred once, mumbling something in Apache, then went limp again. As Jake turned Soldier south toward home, he spotted something in the dirt near the clearing. Fresh wagon tracks heading east. The same tracks he'd seen a month ago near a burned-out Apache camp. The Gaines brothers. It had to be. Rake and Cole Gaines ran the worst gang of cutthroats in the territory. Men who raided isolated camps and homesteads, killed whoever resisted, and sold anything they could carry. The law had been after them for years, but they were smart and careful and always seemed to disappear into the mountains when pressure got too close. If the Gaines brothers had done this, and if they knew this woman had survived, they'd come looking. She was a witness to murder, and Jake had just made himself a target. The ride back to the ranch seemed to take forever. The woman faded in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out, sometimes whispering things he couldn't understand. Jake kept checking her pulse, kept adjusting his grip to make sure she didn't fall. The sun climbed higher, hot on his back, and sweat ran down his face despite the cool mountain air. By the time the broken spur came into view in the valley below, Jake had already started constructing the story he'd tell Tobias and the others. But deep down, he knew there was no story that would make this right, no explanation that would satisfy anyone. He'd crossed a line today, made a choice that would change everything. He'd saved a life, and it might cost him his own. The ride down from the high country tested every bit of Jake's endurance. The woman grew heavier in his arms as exhaustion set in, and twice he had to stop to adjust her position and check that she was still breathing. Each time her pulse was weaker, her skin colder. Time was running out. Dusk was settling over the canyon when Jake finally rode into the ranch yard. Tobias emerged from the house at the sound of hoofbeats, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His expression shifted from welcome to shock in the space of a heartbeat. "Sweet Jesus, Jake, what have you done?" "Get the door," Jake said, his voice rough with fatigue, "and bring the medical kit." "She's been shot." Miguel appeared from the barn, his young face going pale at the sight of the woman. Hank stood in the bunkhouse doorway, his expression hardening into something cold and unreadable. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Tobias dropped the towel and hurried to open the door. "Miguel, help me get her down," Jake said. The boy hesitated, then came forward. Together, they eased the woman from Soldier's back. She was unconscious now, her head lolling against Jake's shoulder. He carried her through the door, past the main room where he and Sarah had spent so many evenings, and into the small guest bedroom that had once been Sarah's sewing room. "Lay her on the bed," Tobias said, already pulling out bandages and bottles from the medical kit. "Miguel, fetch hot water." "Move, boy," Miguel ran. Henk appeared in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. "You lost your mind, Jake? Bringing an Apache here?" "She was dying. Should have let her," Henk said flatly. "Nothing but trouble helping them." Jake turned slowly, and something in his eyes made Hank take a step back. "Get out, Jake, I said get out." His voice was quiet but edged with steel. Hank stared at him for a long moment, then spat on the floor and walked away. Tobias was cutting away the woman's buckskin dress, exposing the wound. The makeshift bandage had soaked through with blood, and the flesh around the bullet hole was inflamed and angry. "Bullet's still in there," he said. "Going to have to dig it out." "I know. You ever done that before?" Jake shook his head. "You? Once during the war. Man died anyway." Tobias looked up, his dark eyes serious. "She's already weak, Jake. Might not survive the shock." "Then we'll have to make sure she does." Miguel returned with a pot of hot water, his hands shaking enough to slosh some on the floor. Tobias set out the tools they'd need. A knife sterilized in flame, clean cloth, whiskey for both cleaning and numbing. Jake looked at the small blade and felt his stomach turn. He'd killed men before, had blood on his hands more times than he could count. But this was different. This was trying to save a life, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. "Hold her arms," Tobias said to Miguel. "She's going to fight when the pain hits." The boy nodded, moving to grip her wrists. Jake positioned himself to hold her legs. Tobias poured whiskey over the wound, and even unconscious, the woman's body jerked. Then he positioned the knife and began to probe. Her scream when she came awake was something Jake would hear in his nightmares for years to come. She thrashed and fought with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so injured, eyes wild and unseeing, speaking rapidly in Apache. Miguel struggled to hold her wrists. Jake pressed down on her legs, hating himself, hating the necessity of causing her more pain. "Almost got it," Tobias muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "There!" The bullet came out with a wet sound, small and deformed. Tobias dropped it into a bowl and immediately pressed clean cloth against the wound. The woman's struggles weakened, her cries fading to whimpers. Then she went limp again, and for a terrible moment Jake thought they'd lost her. "She's breathing," Tobias said, checking her pulse. "But it's weak. Next few hours will tell." Jake stood, his legs shaking, and walked to the window. Outside, full dark had fallen. Somewhere out there, the men who'd shot her were probably making camp, congratulating themselves on a successful raid. Maybe they knew she'd survived. Maybe they were already planning to come looking. "You want to tell me what happened?" Tobias asked, bandaging the wound with practiced hands. Jake told him, the gunfire, the bodies, finding her in the rocks. He told him about the wagon tracks, about his suspicion that it was the Gaines brothers. When he finished, Tobias was quiet for a long time. "You know what this means," the old man finally said. "I know. Town's going to hear about it. Sheriff's gonna have questions. And if it really was the Gaines gang—" "I know, Tobias." Miguel spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Why did you bring her here, Mr. Jake?" It was a good question. Jake had been asking himself the same thing for the past 6 hours. He looked at the woman lying unconscious on the bed, her black hair spread across Sarah's old pillow, her face peaceful now in sleep. She looked young, vulnerable, human, because it was the right thing to do, he said finally, "even if it gets us all killed." Hank's voice came from the doorway. He'd returned but kept his distance. "Even if every Apache in the territory decides to come burn us out for keeping one of their women." "The Apache aren't the ones we should be worried about," Jake said. "It's whoever shot her that'll be coming." Tobias finished with the bandages and pulled a blanket over the woman. "She needs rest and fluids. If infection sets in—" He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what infection meant out here. Miles from a real doctor. "I'll stay with her tonight," Jake said. "You need rest too." "I'll rest when I know she's going to make it." Miguel and Tobias exchanged glances, but didn't argue. They left, Miguel casting one last curious look at the woman before closing the door. Hank lingered a moment longer. "This is a mistake." "Jake, a big one." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Hank shook his head and walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, alone with the woman. Jake pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He'd left a lamp burning low, enough to see by without being too bright. The medicine pouch she'd been clutching lay on the bedside table, and Jake picked it up carefully. The beadwork was intricate, geometric patterns in red and white and blue. He wondered who had made it for her. A mother, a grandmother, someone who loved her enough to spend hours on something meant to keep her safe. He thought about Sarah's things, still packed in boxes in the back of the closet. Her dresses, her books, the sampler she'd been working on when she got sick. He'd meant to give them away or burn them, but he could never bring himself to do it. They were all he had left of her. Even if looking at them hurt, he reached into his vest and pulled out his father's pocket watch, checking the time. Nearly midnight. He wound it carefully, listening to the familiar ticking, then set it on the table next to the medicine pouch. Two objects, two worlds, sitting side by side. The woman stirred and Jake leaned forward. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as she registered where she was. She tried to sit up, gasping at the pain, and Jake gently pressed her back down. "Easy. You're safe." She spoke in Apache, her voice weak but urgent. Jake shook his head. "I don't understand most of what you're saying, but you're at my ranch. Those men who shot you, they're not here. You're safe." She stared at him for a long moment, then her eyes moved to the medicine pouch. Jake picked it up and held it out to her. She took it with trembling fingers, clutched it to her chest, and something in her expression softened slightly. Not trust, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that he meant her no harm. "Water?" Jake asked, miming drinking. She nodded, and he helped her sit up enough to drink from a tin cup. She managed 3 small sips before collapsing back, exhausted. "What's your name?" Jake asked. Though he didn't expect her to understand, to his surprise, she spoke. One word, barely a whisper. "Ayana. Ayana," he repeated, trying to get the pronunciation right. She nodded slightly. Jake touched his chest. "Jacob. Jake." Her eyes closed again, but her breathing was steadier now. She was still gripping the medicine pouch even in sleep. Jake settled back in his chair, knowing he wouldn't sleep tonight. He'd keep watch, keep her safe, and deal with whatever consequences came in the morning. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, and the wind moved through the canyon with a sound like distant voices. The night stretched out long and uncertain, and Jake sat in the lamplight next to a woman whose life he'd saved, wondering if he'd just signed his own death warrant. 3 days passed in a rhythm of careful tending and cautious hope. Ayana's fever broke on the 2nd night, and by the 3rd morning she was able to sit up without help. She still said little, watching Jake and the others with wary eyes, but she accepted food and water without resistance. Her strength returned slowly, like spring grass pushing through winter snow. Jake learned her name meant eternal blossom in her language. She taught him this through gestures and the few English words she knew, drawing a flower in the air and then pointing to herself. He tried to teach her more English, pointing to objects and saying their names. Cup, blanket, window. She repeated them carefully, her accent thick but her determination clear. Tobias proved surprisingly knowledgeable about Apache healing practices. "Worked with an Apache scout once, back in my army days," he explained, brewing a tea from plants he kept dried in the kitchen. "He taught me some things. This here's for pain and healing." He brought it to Ayana, who sniffed it cautiously before drinking. Whatever was in it seemed to help. She slept better that night. Miguel was the first to truly warm to her. The young man had a gentle nature that seemed to transcend language barriers. He brought her wildflowers one morning, setting them in a tin cup by her bedside. Ayana's face softened at the gesture, and she spoke to him in Apache, words Jake didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. "Thank you." Hank remained distant and disapproving, but even he couldn't maintain outright hostility in the face of her obvious vulnerability. He simply avoided the house, spending his time in the bunkhouse or out riding fence lines. On the fourth day, Jake had to ride into Copper Ridge for supplies. He'd put it off as long as he could, but they needed flour and coffee and ammunition. He told Tobias to keep watch, took his rifle, and made the journey with dread sitting heavy in his stomach. The town knew. He could tell the moment he rode down Main Street. Conversation stopped. People stared. Patterson at the general store was polite but cool as he filled Jake's order. "Heard you brought someone back from the high country?" Patterson said, not quite meeting Jake's eyes. "Word travels fast." "It does. Especially when it's that kind of news." Jake paid for his supplies without comment and was loading them onto his horse when Sheriff Crenshaw appeared. The lawman's face was serious, troubled. "Jake, we need to talk." They walked to the sheriff's office and Crenshaw closed the door behind them. "The Gaines brothers are asking questions. Word came through yesterday. They're looking for an Apache woman. Say she's a witness to murder." Jake's stomach dropped, but he kept his face neutral. "That's so. Don't play games with me, Jake. Is she at your place?" A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Jake nodded. Crenshaw cursed softly and sat down behind his desk. "You know what you've done? The Gaines gang doesn't leave witnesses. They'll come for her, and they won't care who gets in the way. I know, then why? Why risk everything for an Apache woman you don't even know?" Jake thought about that question. He'd been asking himself the same thing for days. "You remember when Sarah was sick? How the whole town came together? Brought food, sat with her, prayed for her? Of course, nobody asked if she deserved help. Nobody questioned whether it was worth the trouble. They just did it because it was right." Jake met Crenshaw's eyes. "This is the same thing. It's not the same, and you know it. Sarah was one of us, and that woman bleeding in the rocks wasn't one of anybody. She was just someone who needed help." Jake leaned forward. "I was an Army scout, Bill. I've seen what happens when we stop seeing people as people. I won't be part of that anymore." Crenshaw was quiet for a long moment. "The Gaines brothers have been raiding Apache camps, selling captives across the border. She probably saw the whole thing, saw them kill her people. Her father and brother," Jake said quietly. "That's what I think from what I could tell. Then they definitely want her dead." Crenshaw rubbed his face. "I can't protect you from this, Jake. If they come for her, that's outside my jurisdiction. I'm not asking you to, but I'm telling you, if you don't hand her over, you're making yourself a target. And not just from the Gaines gang. There are people in this town who won't take kindly to you harboring an Apache." Jake stood to leave. "I appreciate the warning, Bill, but my mind's made up." On the ride back to the ranch, Jake replayed the conversation in his mind. Crenshaw was right. He was making himself a target. But turning Ayanna over to the Gaines brothers, or even just sending her away wounded and alone, wasn't something he could live with. Some choices defined who you were. This was one of them. He found Ayanna sitting up in bed when he returned, looking out the window at the canyon. She'd been in Sarah's old nightgown. Tobias had found it in a trunk, and her long black hair was clean now, combed and braided. She turned when Jake entered, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. "You came back," she said in halting English. "Of course I did. This is my home." She touched the silver cross that hung on the wall near the bed, one of Sarah's things that Jake had never been able to put away. "You lost someone," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. Jake nodded, surprised she'd picked up on that. "My wife. 3 years ago, I lost—" She struggled for the words, then switched to Apache, speaking slowly so he might understand. He caught enough. "Brother, father, mother, long ago." A litany of loss that matched his own. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him steadily, and something passed between them. A recognition of shared grief, of understanding what it meant to survive when others didn't. She picked up the deerskin map that had been in her belongings, one of the few things besides the medicine pouch that she'd been carrying. She unfolded it carefully, showing him marks and symbols he didn't fully understand. "My people," she said, pointing to a mark in the mountains. "Safe place." Then she pointed to another mark, and her face darkened. "Bad men come. Jake looked at the map, seeing the care with which it had been drawn. This was more than just a guide. It was a record of sacred places, of home. And the bad men had taken it all away. They won't hurt you again, Jake said. I promise you that. She studied his face for a long moment, then slowly reached out and touched his hand. It was brief, tentative, but it was trust. The beginning of it, anyway. Outside, the sun was setting over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of red and gold. Jake sat with Ayanna in comfortable silence. Two broken people finding unexpected solace in each other's company, while the world outside prepared to test whether his promise was one he could keep. A week slipped by, then another. Ayanna grew stronger each day, moving from bed to chair to tentative walks around the room. By the third week, she was well enough to sit on the porch in the morning sun, watching the ranch hands work. The wound in her shoulder healed cleanly, leaving a puckered scar that she touched sometimes with a distant expression, as if remembering the day it happened. The routine of the ranch absorbed her gradually. She began helping Tobias in the kitchen, learning to make coffee the way the men liked it, and baking bread with quiet concentration. Her hands moved with practiced skill, and Jake realized she must have done similar work in her own life before everything changed. They communicated through a growing vocabulary of shared words and gestures, building a bridge between their languages, one careful step at a time. Miguel appointed himself her unofficial teacher, pointing to things and naming them with patient enthusiasm. Horse, sky, fence, corn. She learned quickly, her mind sharp despite the trauma she'd endured. Sometimes Jake would hear her practicing words to herself, repeating them over and over until the pronunciation satisfied her. One evening, Jake found her standing in front of the cavalry saber that hung above the fireplace. It was old, the blade notched from hard use, the handle worn smooth by sweat and time. She reached up to touch it, then pulled back as if it had burned her. "You a soldier," she said, the words awkward but clear. Jake nodded slowly. "A long time ago. You fight my people." It wasn't a question. Jake felt the weight of those years settle on him like stones. "Yes, I was an army scout. I tracked Apache warriors for the cavalry." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why you saved me?" It was a fair question, and one he'd asked himself many times. How could he reconcile the man he'd been with, the man he was trying to be? "Because I saw things during those years that I'm not proud of. Things that keep me awake at night. And I decided I was done being part of that." "What things?" Jake hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. "I saw soldiers kill people who weren't fighting. Old men, women, children. I saw camps burned, food supplies destroyed, families torn apart." He paused, the memories sharp and painful. "The last time, there was a lieutenant named Harrison. He ordered his men to fire on a peaceful camp. Women and children, Ayanna. They weren't warriors. They were just people trying to survive. What you do?" I stopped him. Shot the rifle from his hand. Told my men to stand down. Jake's jaw tightened. "Harrison tried to have me court-martialed for insubordination. I left before they could hang me. Changed my name, came here, tried to start over." The room was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire. Ayanna moved closer, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he held her gaze, letting her see the truth of what he was telling her. "My mother," she said finally, "was killed by soldiers when I was small. My father, he hid me and my brother. We live." She touched her chest. "Here, much pain. Always. I'm sorry. You say sorry. But sorry not bring back." Her English was broken, but her meaning was clear. "Why you different now?" Jake thought about that. "Because I learned that hate just breeds more hate. That killing just leads to more killing. Someone has to stop. Someone has to say, 'This ends with me.'" She was quiet for a long moment, then did something that surprised him. She took his hand and placed it over her heart, then placed her own hand over his. "Shiyahi," she said softly. It was an Apache word he didn't know. "What does that mean?" She struggled, searching for the English words. "You are my heart." "Not love, not yet. But connection, trust, you understand?" Jake understood. He felt it too, this growing connection between them that went deeper than gratitude or obligation. She saw him, really saw him, including the broken parts, and she hadn't turned away. It was a gift he hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Jake was at the door in seconds, rifle in hand. Miguel burst into the yard, having been out checking fence lines, his face flushed with alarm. "Riders coming," he said, breathing hard. 6 of them, maybe more. "Coming from the east." Jake's stomach dropped. "How far?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Tobias appeared from the bunkhouse, his own rifle ready. Even Hank emerged, his expression grim but resolved. They'd all known this day would come. The only question had been when. "Ayana, get inside," Jake said. "Stay away from the windows." She understood the urgency, if not all the words. But instead of moving towards safety, she stepped closer to Jake. "I can fight." "No. If they see you fighting, they'll kill you on sight. Please, trust me." Something in his tone got through to her. She nodded once and disappeared into the house. Jake turned to his men, because that's what they were now. A unified front against whatever was coming. "Could be anyone," Tobias said, though they all knew who it probably was. "If it's the Gaines gang, they'll want her. And they won't ask nicely." Jake checked his rifle, made sure his pistol was loaded. "Nobody shoots unless I give the word. Maybe we can talk them down." Hank snorted. "You really believe that?" "No, but I have to try." The riders appeared over the rise, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. 6 of them, just as Miguel had said, all armed and moving with the casual confidence of men who'd done violence before and expected to do it again. They spread out as they approached, surrounding the ranch yard in a loose semicircle. Strategic, professional. The man in the center was tall and lean, with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. Jake recognized him from wanted posters in the sheriff's office. Rick Gaines, named for the way he'd rake over a place, leaving nothing but ruin behind. "Jacob Mallory," Gaines called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to have ourselves a conversation." Jake stepped off the porch, rifle held low but ready. "Say what you came to say." Gaines smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Heard you found something of ours up in the high country. An Apache woman. We've come to collect her. She's not yours to collect. See, that's where you're wrong. She's a witness to a crime. And witnesses, well, they tend to have accidents out here in the territory." Gaines leaned forward in his saddle. "Now you seem like a reasonable man. Smart enough to know when he's outmatched. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to bring her out here, hand her over nice and peaceful, and we'll ride away. No harm done, and if I don't?" Gaines's smile widened. "Then we'll burn your ranch to the ground and take her anyway. Your choice, friend. But either way, we're leaving here with that Apache woman." Jake felt the weight of his rifle in his hands, the familiar presence of his men standing behind him, and somewhere inside the house. Ayana waiting to see if his promise to protect her meant anything. He thought about Sarah, about the man he'd been and the man he wanted to be, about lines that once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. "She stays with me," Jake said quietly. Rick Gaines stopped smiling. "Then I guess we do this the hard way." The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Rick Gaines raised his hand, and his men reached for their weapons. Jake's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. "Sheriff Crenshaw knows you're here. I sent Miguel to town this morning. You shoot us, and every lawman in the territory will be hunting you by sundown." It was a bluff, but a good one. Gaines hesitated, his hand hovering near his pistol. His eyes narrowed, calculating odds and consequences. Finally, he lowered his hand, and his men followed suit. "Smart," Gaines said. "But this ain't over, Mallory. We'll be watching. And the moment you slip up, the moment that woman steps foot off your property, she's ours." He turned his horse. "Enjoy your borrowed time." The gang rode out slowly, deliberately, making sure Jake understood this was a tactical retreat, not a surrender. When they disappeared over the ridge, Jake felt his legs start to shake. He'd gambled and somehow won. For now, that was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen, Tobias said quietly. Probably both. Inside, Ayana stood by the window, her face pale. She'd understood enough to know how close they'd come to violence. Jake crossed to her, and without thinking, pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed against him, her head resting on his chest. "They'll come back," she said. "I know. You should let me go." "Save yourself." Jake pulled back to look at her face. "Is that what you want?" She was quiet for a long moment. "No, but I not want you to die for me. Then we'll make sure nobody dies." He tried to sound more confident than he felt. "We just bought ourselves some time. We need to use it wisely." Over the next few days, Jake turned the ranch into something resembling a fort. They reinforced the doors with extra timber, positioned barrels of water around the buildings in case of fire, and stockpiled ammunition. He taught Ayanna to shoot, taking her out to a secluded spot where they could practice without drawing attention. She was a natural. Her hands were steady, her eye good, and she learned quickly. After the first session, she could hit a target at 50 yards. After the third, she rarely missed. "My father teach me," she explained, lowering the rifle. "He say Apache woman must be strong, must protect family. Your father was a wise man," she smiled, but it was touched with sadness. "He was. He want peace. He say fighting only bring more death. But peace," she struggled for the words, "peace not possible when men like Gaines exist." They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. The evening was cool, pleasant, and for a moment Jake could almost forget the danger hanging over them. "Tell me about your wife," Ayanna said suddenly. Jake tensed. He rarely spoke about Sarah, found it too painful. But something about Ayanna's open expression, her genuine interest, made him want to share. Her name was Sarah. She had red hair and green eyes, and she laughed like... He paused, searching for the right words. Like music. Everything was brighter when she was around. She made this place feel like home. How she'd die. Fever. It came through the town one summer. We fought it for days, but his voice caught. In the end, there was nothing I could do. I sat beside her bed and watched her slip away, and I couldn't save her. Ayanna reached out and took his hand. Her palm was warm, calloused from work. "You carry much pain. We all carry pain. It's what we do with it that matters." She squeezed his hand gently. "You use your pain to help others, to help me." That is, she searched for the word. Noble, good. Something shifted between them in that moment. The air felt charged, electric. Jake became acutely aware of how close she was standing, of the way the fading light caught in her dark hair, of the quiet strength in her eyes. He leaned toward her, drawn by something he couldn't name and didn't want to resist. Then Miguel's voice called from the ranch, breaking the spell. "Mr. Jake! Tobias says supper's ready." They pulled apart, both slightly breathless. Ayanna smiled, a real smile this time, reaching her eyes, and started back toward the house. Jake followed, his heart still beating faster than it should. That night after supper, Ayanna presented him with something she'd been working on. A woven bracelet made from strips of leather and colored thread she'd found around the ranch. The pattern was intricate, traditional Apache design, and she'd clearly spent hours on it. "For you," she said, holding it out. "To say thank you. For everything." Jake took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was beautiful, each knot perfectly tied, each color chosen with care. I don't know what to say." "You say nothing. Just wear it." She took it back and tied it around his wrist, her fingers gentle. "Now you carry peace of my people. Reminder that not all Apache are enemy. Not all white men are enemy. Some people, they just people." Jake looked down at the bracelet, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not just gratitude, but connection, trust, the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. "Ayanna, She placed a finger on his lips, stopping him. "Not yet. Too much danger. Too much," she gestured vaguely. "Unknown. But when this is over, when we are safe, then we talk. Yes?" "Yes," Jake agreed, though part of him wanted to say everything right now, consequences be damned. She smiled and rose, heading to her room. At the doorway she paused and looked back. "Good night, Jacob Mallory. Good night, Ayanna." He sat by the fire long after everyone else had gone to bed, turning the bracelet on his wrist and thinking about second chances. About how life could surprise you when you least expected it. About how sometimes the right thing and the hard thing were the same thing. And you just had to have the courage to see it through. Outside, the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. 3 weeks of uneasy peace passed. The Gaines gang hadn't returned, but Jake knew they were out there watching, waiting for their moment. He could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on him, making every shadow suspicious, every distant sound a potential threat. Then Sheriff Crenshaw arrived one morning, riding hard, his face grim. He dismounted quickly and strode toward Jake with a folded paper in his hand. "We need to talk. Inside. Now." Jake led him into the house. Tobias was there, and Ayanna, who'd been helping prepare breakfast. She looked up at Crenshaw's entrance, her expression wary. The sheriff nodded to her politely, then turned his attention to Jake. "I came across something yesterday. Something I wish I hadn't found." He unfolded the paper and laid it on the table. It was a wanted poster, yellowed with age but still legible, and the face staring back from it made Jake's blood run cold. It was his face. Younger, without the lines and grey hair, but unmistakably him. Above the drawing in bold letters, "Wanted for murder, desertion, $500 reward." The name beneath the picture wasn't Jacob Mallory. It was Lieutenant James Brennan. Tobias sucked in a sharp breath. Ayanna looked from the poster to Jake, confusion and hurt warring in her expression. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Crenshaw sat down heavily. "You want to tell them, or should I?" Jake's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the table to steady them. "My real name is James Brennan. I was a cavalry lieutenant serving under Colonel Marcus Harrison in the Apache campaigns of '74. "Jake," Tobias started. But Jake held up a hand. "Let me finish, please." He took a breath, steadying himself. He was a brutal man. Believed the only good Indian was a dead one. He'd order attacks on peaceful camps, burn food supplies in the winter, separate families. I followed orders for longer than I should have. Told myself I was just doing my duty. The room was silent, except for the ticking of his father's pocket watch on the mantel. Then came a village near the White River. Small place, maybe 30 people. Old men, women, children. They'd surrendered peacefully, turned in their weapons, asked for safe passage to the reservation. Harrison gave the order to attack anyway. Said they were all hostiles, that leaving them alive would just cause trouble later. Jake's voice was steady now, flat, as if he were reporting events that had happened to someone else. I refused the order. Told my men to stand down. Harrison drew his weapon on me. Said he'd shoot me for insubordination if I didn't comply. He paused. I shot him first. Not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet shattered his gun hand. "Sweet Jesus," Tobias breathed. "The camp got away. My men helped them. They'd seen what Harrison was too, and they were tired of it. But killing an officer, even to save lives, is a hanging offense. So I ran, changed my name. Ended up here." Jake looked at Ayanna. "That's who I am. A deserter. A wanted man." She was very still, her dark eyes searching his face. "You saved those people. My people. It doesn't change what I did. The law says I'm a criminal." Crenshaw cleared his throat. "There's more. The Gaines brothers know who you are, or rather who you were. They've got contacts, informants. Word is they're planning to turn you in for the bounty after they get what they want from Ayanna." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. "They'll kill her, then hand me over to the army. 2 birds, 1 stone. That about sums it up. And I can't protect you from federal charges, Jake. That's beyond my jurisdiction." Crenshaw looked genuinely pained. "I was there that day, you know. At White River. I was just a private then, part of your unit." Jake's head snapped up. "What?" "Harrison was going to order us all to fire. You stopped him. You saved those people, and you saved us from having to live with that on our conscience." Crenshaw's jaw tightened. "I've kept your secret all these years because of that. Because you did the right thing, even when it cost you everything." Ayanna stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window, her back to them all. Jake wanted to go to her, to explain, but he didn't know what he could possibly say. When she turned around, tears were streaming down her face. "My grandmother," she said, her voice breaking. "She was at White River. She tells story of soldier who refused to kill, who stopped the others. She say he saved her life, saved many lives. She pray for him every day, this soldier she never know name of. The room spun. Jake gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Your grandmother, she died 2 winters ago. But before, she always say, somewhere good white man exist. Man who see Apache as people. She make me promise, if I ever meet him, I thank him. Ayana crossed the room and stood in front of Jake, her eyes shining. I think I meet him now. The weight of it was too much. Jake felt tears burning in his own eyes. All these years, he'd thought that day had ruined his life, had believed his choice had cost him everything and given him nothing but guilt and exile. But here was proof, living, breathing proof, that it had mattered, that saving those lives had echoed forward through time in ways he'd never imagined. Ayana took his face in her hands. You are good man, James Brennan. Jacob Mallory. Whatever name, you are good man. My grandmother knew this. I know this. I'm still a wanted man. Still a deserter in the eyes of the law. Then law is wrong. She said it with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that Jake almost believed it himself. Crenshaw stood. There might be a way out of this. Harrison survived that day, but his career was over. Dishonorable discharge for conduct unbecoming. He's been trying to get back at you ever since, keeping that bounty active. But, he paused, choosing his words carefully. But I kept records. Statements from the men who were there. Evidence of Harrison's orders, his brutality. If we can get those statements to the right people. You kept evidence all these years. Tobias asked, I'm a lawman. I document things. Crenshaw allowed himself a small smile. And I figured someday, justice might need a helping hand. Jake felt something loosen in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the first stirring of possibility. What are you saying, Bill? I'm saying maybe we can clear your name. Get that bounty lifted. But it'll take time and paperwork and... He glanced toward the door, toward the horizon where the Gaines gang was surely waiting. And first, we need to make sure you live long enough to see it through. The plan took shape over the next hour. Crenshaw would ride to the territorial capital, present the evidence to the military authorities. Meanwhile, Jake and the others would fortify the ranch, prepare for the inevitable attack. If they could hold off the Gaines gang long enough for Crenshaw to return with official word of Jake's pardon, the gang would lose their leverage. It was a long shot. But it was a shot. After Crenshaw left, Jake stood on the porch with Ayana. The sun was high and hot, but a cool breeze moved through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and dust. You not tell me the truth, she said quietly. You have secrets. I'm sorry. No, she turned to him. I understand secrets. I understand why you hide, but... She took his hand, laced her fingers through his. No more secrets, yes? We trust each other now. All the way. Jake nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. They stood that way for a long time. Two people with tangled pasts and uncertain futures, finding strength in each other. Inside, Tobias was making coffee. Miguel was checking the rifles. Hank was securing the barn. They were preparing for war. But here, in this moment, there was peace. A fragile, precious peace that Jake would fight with everything he had to protect. She-ya-he, Ayana whispered against his chest. What does that mean again? Jake asked, though he remembered. She pulled back to look at him, her eyes soft. You are my heart, and Jake kissed her. Softly at first, tentatively, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, and kissed him back with a fierceness that spoke of loss and longing and hope all tangled together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. When this is over, she agreed. We talk about tomorrow. But first, we survived today. It was, Jake thought, the most sensible thing anyone had ever said. Sheriff Crenshaw rode out that afternoon, carrying with him years of carefully preserved evidence and the weight of all their hopes. Jake watched him disappear over the ridge, then turned back to the ranch. They had at best 3 or 4 days before the Gaines gang made their move. Every hour had to count. The transformation of the broken spur began immediately. Miguel proved surprisingly resourceful, suggesting defensive positions Jake hadn't considered. My father he fight in the revolution back home. the young man explained. He teach me about defending a position. They reinforce the barn with extra timber, creating shooting positions with clear fields of fire. Tobias organized the water barrels strategically around the buildings, not just for drinking, but to fight fires if the gang tried to burn them out. Hank, his earlier hostility forgotten in the face of real danger, worked on shoring up the weakest points in their perimeter, and Ayanna, she moved through it all with quiet determination, helping where she could, learning their defensive strategy, insisting on being given a rifle and a position. I will not hide, she said firmly when Jake suggested she stay in the house. If they come for me, I fight beside you. By evening, the ranch looked different, more fortress than home. Jake walked the perimeter as the sun set, checking sight lines, making mental notes of where each person would be positioned. He carried the Winchester rifle that Sarah's initials were engraved on, a gift from her father, passed to Jake after their wedding. He ran his fingers over the letters worn smooth by years of handling. S.M. Sarah Mallory. She would understand, Ayanna said, appearing beside him. She moved quietly, a skill from her Apache upbringing. What you doing? Why you fight, you think so? I know so. Woman who marry man like you, she know his heart. She know he do what is right, even when hard. Ayanna looked out at the canyon, at the land painted gold and crimson by the dying sun. She want you to live, to be happy again. Jake was quiet for a moment. I loved her very much. I know, and Ayanna paused, choosing her words carefully. I not try to replace her, cannot replace, but maybe there is room in heart for both, for memory of her and for... She gestured between them, uncertain. For this, Jake finished. For us. She nodded, and he saw relief in her expression. They stood in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, as the stars began to emerge overhead. That night, the group gathered in the main house for what might be their last peaceful meal together. Tobias had made his best stew, thick with beef and vegetables, and fresh bread that filled the house with warmth and comfort. They ate slowly, savoring it, talking about small things, the weather, the horses, Miguel's clumsy attempts to court a girl in town the last time he'd been there. It felt normal almost, like they were just a family sharing supper, not people preparing for a fight that some of them might not survive. After the meal, as the others drifted away to check weapons and defensive positions one last time, Jake and Ayanna found themselves alone in the room that had been Sarah's, the room that was now Ayanna's. She sat on the edge of the bed, and Jake pulled a chair close, their knees almost touching. Tell me about your family, Jake said. Your real family before everything. Ayanna's face softened with memory. My mother died when I was young. Sickness, like your Sarah. But I remember her songs, her hands weaving baskets. My father, he was strong man but gentle. He want peace for our people. He say fighting bring only more death, more sorrow. My brother, he was opposite. Young, full of fire. Want to fight soldiers, drive them from our land. What happened to him? He die in raid 2 years ago. My father never same after. He give up warrior way. Take our family to quiet place in mountains. Try to live peaceful. Her voice broke slightly. But peace not enough. Bad men still come. My father, he die protecting me. Tell me to run, to hide. I find the rocks, but they shoot me anyway. Jake took her hand, holding it gently. I'm so sorry. You saved me when I have nothing left. Give me reason to keep living. You understand? She looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. Before you, I want to die, want to be with my family. But you show me life still have meaning, still have, she searched for the word, purpose. You did the same for me. I was just going through the motions before you came, working until I was too tired to think, sleeping, then doing it all again. You made me remember what it feels like to care about something, to want to protect something. Ayanna leaned forward and kissed him, soft and lingering. When she pulled back, her expression was serious. Promise me something, anything. If tomorrow goes bad, if I am hurt or dying, you do not do something stupid. You live. You keep living. No, she gripped his hand tighter. My grandmother, she survived because of you. She have children and grandchildren. That is your legacy, Jacob. James. Life, not death. Promise me you remember that. I promise, Jake said, though the words felt heavy as stones. But you have to promise me the same thing. If it comes down to it, if you can escape, you run. You don't look back. She shook her head. I already tell you. I not leave you, Ayana. No. Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. We survive together, or we die together. That is how it is. You accept this. Jake looked at her, this woman who'd come into his life bleeding and broken and had somehow become the most important person in his world, and realized arguing was pointless. She'd made her choice, just as he'd made his. Together, he agreed. They made love that night, tender and desperate and full of unspoken words. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. The room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight through the window. What will you do? Ayana asked quietly. If we survive, if Sheriff bring papers that make you free. Jake thought about that. I don't know. I've spent so many years running, hiding. I'm not sure I remember how to just live. I teach you, she said with certainty. We learn together. What about you? What do you want? She was quiet for a long moment. I want family again, home, place where I belong. With you, if you want that too. Jake's throat tightened. He thought about the silver wedding ring still in his drawer, the one that had been Sarah's. He'd kept it all these years, unable to part with it, unable to imagine giving it to anyone else. But now, lying here with Ayana in his arms, he could imagine it, could see a future where the past and present somehow coexisted, where loving again didn't mean forgetting what came before. I want that too, he said, more than anything. They fell asleep that way, wrapped around each other, stealing what peace they could before the storm. Dawn came too quickly. Jake woke to Tobias's hand on his shoulder, the old man's face grim. They're here. Jake was dressed and armed in minutes. Ayana moved beside him, checking her rifle with practiced efficiency. They stepped out onto the porch together, and Jake's heart sank. The Gaines gang had grown. What had been 6 men was now 12, maybe 15, spreading out in a loose circle around the ranch. They'd brought reinforcements, more guns, and they looked confident. This wasn't a negotiation, this was an execution. Rake Gaines sat his horse at the center, that cruel smile playing on his scarred face. Beside him was another man Jake recognized. From wanted posters, Cole Gaines, Rake's brother, even meaner if the stories were true. Morning, Mallory, Rake called out, or should I say Lieutenant Brennan? See, we've been doing some research on you. Turns out you're worth a fair bit of money. Dead or alive. Jake said nothing, just watched, calculating distances and angles of fire. Here's what's going to happen, Rake continued. You're going to give us the Apache woman. Then you're going to come with us quietly. We'll turn you over to the army, collect our bounty, and everyone gets what they want. Except us, Jake pointed out. Well, yeah, except you. Rake's smile widened. But you don't really have a choice here. Look around. You're outnumbered 3-1. You can't win this. Maybe not, Jake said. He was aware of Tobias at the window to his left, Miguel in the barn loft with a clear shot, Hank at the north position, and Ayana standing beside him, rifle ready, her jaw set with determination. But we can make you pay for it. Something flickered in Rake's eyes. Respect, maybe, or just the recognition of a man who wouldn't break easily. You know, I almost admire you, Brennan. You've got spine, but spine won't stop bullets. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. Last chance, surrender or die. Jake felt Ayana's hand slip into his, a brief squeeze of connection and strength. Then she let go and raised her rifle, the barrel steady and sure. Then I guess we die, Jake said quietly. The world seemed to hold its breath. Birds stopped singing. The wind died. Even the horses stood still, as if sensing what was about to happen. Rake Gaines's expression hardened. So be it. He raised his hand, ready to give the signal. Jake's finger found the trigger of Sarah's Winchester. Ayana's breathing was calm beside him. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. Rake's hand dropped, and the first shot rang out across the canyon, shattering the morning. Peace, and igniting the firestorm that would determine all their fates. The gunfire erupted like thunder, a chaos of sound and smoke that turned the peaceful morning into hell. Jake dropped to one knee, bringing the Winchester to his shoulder, and fired. His first shot took a rider in the chest, spinning him from his saddle. His second caught another in the shoulder. Beside him, Ayana fired with deadly precision. A bandit aiming at Jake went down, clutching his leg. Another fell backward, his rifle clattering to the ground. She worked the bolt action smoothly, like she'd been doing it all her life, and Jake felt a fierce pride mixed with terror for her safety. From the barn loft, Miguel's rifle barked steadily. He'd positioned himself perfectly, with a commanding view of the yard. Two more of the Gaines men went down under his fire, one screaming, the other silent. Tobias fired from the house window, his old soldier training evident in the calm, methodical way he took his shots. He wasn't fast, but he was accurate. Each bullet counted. The Gaines gang scattered looking for cover. They'd expected an easy fight, a quick surrender. Instead, they'd walked into a prepared defense. But there were still too many of them, and they were recovering from their surprise quickly. "Fall back!" Jake shouted to Ayana. "Get inside!" "No!" She fired again, hitting a man trying to circle toward Miguel's position. A bullet whined past Jake's head, so close he felt the displacement of air. Another splintered the porch post beside him. The gang had found their positions now and were returning fire in earnest. Wood exploded around them. Glass shattered. Cole Gaines charged forward on horseback, firing a pistol in each hand, his face twisted with rage. Jake tracked him, led him slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet took Cole in the chest, and he tumbled from his saddle, hitting the ground hard and not moving. "Cole!" Rake Gaines's scream was pure fury. He spurred his horse forward, abandoning tactics for vengeance. Jake fired at him, but missed. Rake was moving too fast, too erratically. He reached the porch steps and launched himself from the saddle, tackling Jake before he could bring the rifle around. They crashed through the door together, rolling across the floor in a tangle of limbs and violence. Rake was younger, faster, and fueled by rage. His fists hammered into Jake's ribs, his face. Jake blocked what he could and struck back, his size and strength evening the odds. They grappled across the floor, knocking over furniture, each fighting for advantage. Outside, the battle raged. Ayana had retreated to the doorway, firing at the gang members, trying to flank the house. Miguel kept up his steady fire from the barn. But the gang had torches now. Jake saw them through the open door, men preparing to burn them out. "The barn!" Tobias shouted. "They're going for the barn!" Miguel must have seen them too. His fire intensified, desperate now. But there were too many. A torch arced through the air, landed on the barn roof. Then another. Within seconds, flames were spreading. Jake saw it happening while struggling with Rake, saw Miguel stumble from the loft as smoke billowed, coughing, his eyes streaming. The young man made it to the ladder, started down, then a bullet caught him in the leg. He fell the last 10 feet, crying out in pain, "Miguel!" Ayana abandoned her position, running into the open to help him. No. Jake screamed, but he couldn't break free from Rake's grip. A bullet caught Ayana in the thigh. She went down hard, gasping, but kept crawling toward Miguel. Tobias provided covering fire, his old face set with grim determination. He managed to drop 2 more gang members, but then his rifle clicked empty. Jake finally got his hand on Rake's throat and squeezed. The bandit's eyes bulged, his grip loosening. Jake threw him off, scrambled for his pistol, and fired point-blank into Rake's shoulder. The bandit howled, clutching the wound, but there was no time. The barn was fully engulfed now. Hank had abandoned his position, running to help Tobias drag both Miguel and Ayana toward the house. Bullets kicked up dirt around them. One caught Hank in the side, but he kept moving, kept pulling Miguel along. They made it to the porch. Tobias slammed the door shut and started barricading it with furniture. Outside, the remaining gang members, maybe 7 or 8 still standing, were regrouping for a final assault. Jake dropped beside Ayanna. Her leg was bleeding badly, her face pale with shock. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I had to, Miguel. I know." "I know." Jake pressed his hand against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. She was losing too much blood. They all were. Miguel's leg was shattered. Hank had taken a bullet in the ribs. Even Tobias was bleeding from a graze on his arm. They couldn't win this fight. Not anymore. They were wounded, low on ammunition, and the house was filling with smoke from the burning barn. The gang would rush them soon, overwhelm their weakened defense. Jake's father's pocket watch sat on the mantel, still ticking steadily, marking time that was running out. He thought of Sarah, of his promise to keep living. He thought of everything that had led to this moment. Then he remembered something Tobias had mentioned. The old mining tunnel. "Their last desperate chance, Tobias," Jake said, his voice steady despite everything. "The tunnel. We need to go now." Tobias nodded grimly. "In the root cellar. Hidden door in the back wall." Jake scooped Ayanna into his arms. She was light, but every movement sent fresh blood flowing from her wound. "Miguel, can you walk?" The young man gritted his teeth. With help, Hank and Tobias got Miguel to his feet, supporting him between them. Outside, the gang was chanting now, working themselves up for the final rush. The smoke from the burning barn was thick, choking. Soon the house would catch fire too. They moved through the kitchen to the root cellar. Tobias pulled open the trapdoor, revealing stairs descending into darkness. The smell of earth and old vegetables rose up to meet them. Jake went first, carrying Ayanna, his boots finding each step carefully in the dim light. The cellar was small, lined with shelves of preserved food and sacks of potatoes. Tobias pushed past one of the shelves, his hands searching the back wall until he found what he was looking for. A section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a black opening that breathed cold, stale air. "Old silver mine," Tobias explained, lighting a lantern. "Been abandoned for 20 years. Goes clear through the mountain, comes out in a canyon about 2 miles north." Above them, they heard boots thundering across the floor. Shouts. The gang had breached the house. Jake heard rake Gaines bellowing orders, furniture being overturned. "They had maybe seconds go," Jake said. "I'll cover the entrance." "Jake," Ayanna started, but he silenced her with a look. No arguments. "Not now." Tobias and Hank carried Miguel into the tunnel. Ayanna refused to be carried further, insisting on walking despite her wounded leg. She limped after them, one hand pressed against the tunnel wall for support, the other clutching her rifle. Jake waited in the cellar, watching the trap door above. He heard the gang ransacking the house, heard Rake's voice getting closer. Then the trapdoor flew open, and a bandit's face appeared, silhouetted against the smoke-filled air above. Jake fired. The man fell back with a scream. Another tried to come down, and Jake fired again. The narrow stairs made them easy targets. But his ammunition wouldn't last forever. "Jake!" Tobias's voice echoed from the tunnel. "Come on!" Jake fired twice more, then turned and plunged into the darkness. Behind him, he heard the gang discovering the tunnel entrance. Rake's voice, "After them! Don't let them escape!" The tunnel was narrow, the ceiling low. Jake had to duck to avoid hitting his head on support beams that looked worryingly old and unstable. The lantern Tobias carried ahead provided the only light, casting wild shadows that danced and jumped with each movement. They moved as fast as they could, but Miguel was slowing them down. The young man was trying his best, gritting his teeth against the pain, but his shattered leg could barely support him. Behind them, Jake heard boots in the tunnel. The gang was coming. The tunnel began to slope downward, and the air grew colder, damper. Water dripped from the ceiling. Jake's boots splashed through puddles he couldn't see. Somewhere above, the fire must have weakened the house structure, because he heard a distant rumbling, felt the tunnel shudder. "Move faster," he urged. "The whole thing might collapse." Ayanna was flagging now, her face pale in the lantern light. The blood loss was taking its toll. Jake moved beside her, supporting her with one arm, while keeping his pistol ready with the other. She leaned into him, and he could feel her trembling. A gunshot rang out behind them, deafeningly loud in the confined space. The bullet ricocheted off stone, whining past Jake's head. The gang was closing the distance. "There!" Tobias shouted. Ahead, Jake could see it, a lighter patch of darkness. The exit. They were close, but so were their pursuers. Jake could hear Rake Gaines now, could hear his breathing, his cursing. The man was relentless, driven by rage and the need for vengeance for his brother. They burst out of the tunnel into a narrow canyon. The morning sun was blinding after the darkness. Jake blinked, trying to adjust, and in that moment of vulnerability, Rake Gaines emerged from the tunnel behind them. "Nowhere left to run, Brennan," Rake snarled. His face was twisted with hate, his shoulder still bleeding from where Jake had shot him. But his gun hand was steady. Tobias tried to raise his rifle, but two more gang members came out behind Rake, their weapons trained on the group. They were trapped, wounded, exhausted, outnumbered. Jake stepped in front of Ayanna, shielding her with his body. His pistol was empty. He'd fired his last shot in the tunnel. He had nothing left but his hands and his determination. "You should have just given her up," Rake said, advancing slowly. "Should have taken the easy way. But no, you had to be a hero. Now you all die." Jake felt something drop from his vest pocket. His father's watch, jarred loose in the desperate flight through the tunnel. It hit the rocks with a crack, the crystal face shattering, the steady ticking stopping abruptly. In that moment, watching the watch, the last connection to his past, to the man he'd been, break on the stones, something crystallized in Jake's mind. The past was gone. Sarah was gone. The lieutenant he'd been was gone. All that mattered was right now, this moment, protecting the people who'd become his family. He launched himself at Rake Gaines with a roar, closing the distance before the bandit could fire. They went down in a tangle, rolling across the rocky ground. Rake's gun went flying. Jake's hands found Rake's throat, and this time he didn't let go. They rolled toward the canyon edge, a sheer drop Jake hadn't noticed in his fury. Rake's eyes widened as he felt the emptiness behind him. He clawed at Jake's hands, desperate now, his earlier confidence gone. "Should have stayed away from my family," Jake said, his voice cold and final. He released Rake and shoved, hard. The bandit's arms windmilled, trying to find balance, but momentum carried him backward. His scream echoed off the canyon walls as he fell, cutting off abruptly when he hit bottom. The two remaining gang members stared in shock. In that moment of hesitation, Hank managed to bring his rifle up, despite his wound, and fired. One went down. Tobias tackled the other, and they grappled briefly before Tobias's knife found its mark. Then it was over. The canyon fell silent, except for the group's ragged breathing and Miguel's quiet groans of pain. Jake stood at the edge, looking down at where Rake Gaines lay broken far below. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only exhaustion and a desperate need to make sure his people survived. He turned to find Ayanna watching him, her eyes full of pain, but also something else. Understanding, acceptance, love. She reached out her hand and he took it, helping her to her feet. "It's over," she whispered. "Yeah," Jake said. "It's over." They stood there in the morning sun, 5 wounded people who'd survived the impossible, and began the long walk toward whatever came next. 3 months later, winter settled over the Arizona territory like a benediction. Snow dusted the canyon walls, and the air held that crystalline clarity that made everything seem sharper, more real. Jake stood on the porch of his new cabin, watching the sun paint the morning sky in shades of rose and gold, and marveled at how much had changed. The broken spur was gone, burned to the ground in the fight with the Gaines gang. But from its ashes, something new had risen. Jake had rebuilt on a different part of his land, away from the memories and the ghosts. The cabin was smaller, simpler, but it felt more like home than the old ranch house ever had. Sheriff Crenshaw had returned with papers from the territorial governor and the army, a full pardon for Lieutenant James Brennan, signed and sealed. The evidence Crenshaw had presented, combined with testimony from the surviving members of Jake's old unit, had been enough to clear his name. The wanted posters were withdrawn. The bounty lifted. For the first time in years, Jake could use his real name without fear, not that he planned to. Jacob Mallory had become who he was, and James Brennan was someone he'd left behind long ago. The pardon was about freedom, not identity. Miguel's leg had healed, though he walked with a slight limp now. He'd stayed on, helping rebuild, and had become like a son to Jake. The young man had grown during the ordeal, his easy smile now tempered with a hardness that came from surviving violence. But underneath, he was still Miguel, still kind, still quick to laugh, still bringing wildflowers to Ayana. Tobias had recovered from his wound and resumed his role as cook and general keeper of order. He'd added a new skill to his repertoire, teaching. He was helping Ayana improve her English, and in return, she was teaching him Apache. The sound of their lessons, mixed with laughter at mutual mistakes, was a constant presence in the cabin. Even Hank had softened. The bullet he'd taken had nearly killed him, and Ayana had sat by his bedside for 3 days while he fought fever and infection. When he finally woke weak but alive, the first thing he'd done was apologize to her. They weren't exactly friends, but they'd reached an understanding built on mutual respect, earned in fire and blood. Ayana. Jake's eyes found her now, moving through the small garden she'd planted near the cabin. Despite the winter chill, some hardy herbs were still growing, and she was harvesting them with practiced hands. She wore a heavy coat against the cold, but underneath it was the dress that the women of Copper Ridge had made for her. A gesture of acceptance that had surprised them both. The town had changed too. The fight with the Gaines gang had become legend, and in the telling and retelling, the story had transformed from scandal to heroism. The giant cowboy who'd protected an Apache woman against impossible odds. The love that bridged 2 worlds. It was romantic, simplified, sanitized of the blood and pain and terror. But Jake didn't mind. If the legend helped people see past their prejudices, even a little, then it was worth the embellishment. Ayana looked up and caught him watching. Her smile was immediate, warm, reaching her eyes in a way that made his heart catch every time. She was pregnant, 3 months along, her belly just beginning to show. They discovered it a month after the battle, and the news had felt like a gift, like proof that life could triumph over death. They'd married quietly, with just Tobias, Miguel, Hank, and Sheriff Crenshaw in attendance. It wasn't legal according to territorial law. Intermarriage was forbidden, but Crenshaw had looked the other way, and the Apache elder Ayana's grandmother had known performed a traditional ceremony. In the ways that mattered, they were husband and wife. Ayana joined him on the porch now, slipping her cold hand into his warm one. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Her English had improved dramatically, though she still had an accent that Jake found charming. "Everything, nothing, how we got here." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "I think about that too. All the things that had to happen, all the pain, all the loss, to bring us to this moment. Do you regret any of it?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret the death. My father, my brother. The violence. But you, us?" She looked up at him. "No, never." Jake pulled her closer. Above the door of their cabin hung a new sign, hand-carved by Miguel during his recovery. "Nuevo Comienzo Ranch," it read. New Beginning Ranch. It was Ayana's idea, a name that honored both their cultures, that spoke of hope and fresh starts. "Your father would be proud of you," Jake said. "You survived. You built something new. You're bringing life into the world." "Our child," Ayana corrected, placing his hand on her belly. "Our beginning." Jake thought about his father's pocket watch, shattered on the rocks during the fight. He'd gone back for it later, found the pieces, kept them in a box. Sometimes he took them out and looked at them, remembering. But he didn't mourn the loss. The watch had marked time for 3 generations of Mallory men, all of whom had died violent deaths. Breaking it felt like breaking a cycle, like giving his child a chance at a different future. Inside the cabin, Tobias was making breakfast. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the open door, along with Miguel's voice, singing something in Spanish, slightly off-key, but enthusiastic. It was ordinary, domestic, perfect. "Come," Ayana said, tugging his hand. "Food is ready." "And you know how Tobias gets when we let it get cold." Jake let her lead him inside, into the warmth and light and laughter of their home. He thought about the day he'd ridden out hunting, expecting nothing more than elk meat and solitude. He'd come back with something infinitely more valuable, a reason to live, a future to build, a family to protect. They gathered around the table, these people who'd survived the impossible together. Tobias said grace in his rumbling voice, thanking the Lord for life and love and second chances. Miguel added his own prayer in Spanish. Hank, never one for many words, simply raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. Ayana looked around the table, her eyes shining, then spoke in Apache. Words Jake had learned meant, I am grateful for my family. To family, Jake echoed in English, and they all drank. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, covering the land in white. The canyon walls stood eternal, unchanged by human drama. Somewhere coyotes called to each other, and an eagle rode the thermals hunting. Life went on, as it always did, finding a way forward, even after fire and blood and loss. Jake reached under the table and found Ayana's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was everything they'd fought for: connection, trust, love, hope. The future was uncertain, as it always was. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. They had their makeshift family. They had a home. And really, Jake thought as he watched the people he loved share a meal in the warmth of their cabin, what more could anyone ask for? The wild frontier continued its restless existence all around them. But here, in this one place, two people who should have been enemies had found peace. Two worlds that should have remained separate had merged into something new and beautiful. Sometimes, Jake knew, the greatest hunts didn't end with a kill. Sometimes they ended with saving a life. And sometimes, if you were blessed beyond measure, that life saved you right back. He looked at Ayana, at the curve of her smile and the light in her eyes and the promise of their child growing within her, and knew with absolute certainty that every hard choice, every sacrifice, every moment of terror had been worth it. This was his reward. This was his redemption. This was his new beginning, and it was everything.